Welcome to Let's Talk Learning Technology. Do you know the latest in learning technology? Matt and Walter do. From learning authoring tools and animation to virtual reality and everything in between, innovative learning groups Matt Kurtin and Walter Schirmacher geek out on all of it. Get their perspectives on the latest trends, tips and tricks, and recommendations so your learning tech keeps up with the times.
Hi, and welcome everyone to another episode of LT Squared. I'm ILG programmer Walter Schirmacher.
And I'm Matt Kurtin, ILG Senior Director of Technology and Visual Design.
We have a great episode on tap today. Today we're talking about learning management and tracking systems. We're going to cover a number of topics. We're going to talk about what's the difference between like LMSs, LXPs, and all the alphabet soup we can get into. Talk a little bit about selection. How do you approach selection? And we're also going to talk about tracking. How do you track an e-learning versus virtual reality? Matt, you spent a lot of time on LMSs and tracking systems, so why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure, Walter. So I've worked on learning management system selection projects, trying to help what's the best system that a company could use to fulfill their learning management needs. And I've also run across this in learning strategy projects where we're trying to set up for the learning tracking and delivery systems.
I've heard a lot of terms, LMS, LXP, XAPI. Can you help us with some of this alphabet soup?
So LMS is learning management system. LXP would be a learning experience platform. And XAPI is the experience API, which is really a communication protocol for how you send data to an LRS, which is a learning record store.
Wow, how do you keep track of all the acronyms?
It's really based on what the systems do, starting out with what is it that you need that system to do for you. So a traditional learning management system was always your way to find learning from a central course catalog or to have learning assigned to you. It really is focused mostly on required learning that you have to take or compliance training that an organization wants you to take. It could be a part of a larger suite that has performance, talent, recruiting, etc. And as learning management systems grew over time, they added more and more features. But they weren't really focused on being a user-friendly learning catalog, easy to browse. And that's where the LXP, or the Learning Experience Platform, came about. Is a system that works more like when you are watching movies on Netflix and that one ended and you want to get a recommendation for what's good for you next. The Learning Experience Platform should help find what's best for you next, either based on what you've already taken before or what other people in a similar role to you have taken before. So those are some of the differences between the traditional learning management system and the learning experience platform. Again, with the learning management system being based more on what you have to take, and the learning experience platform may be more on what you'd like to take because you're trying to advance in your career.
That's interesting. Do you think learning experience platforms are they going to replace learning management systems, or are they like in addition to them?
Well, that is a good question because obviously the learning management systems see the learning experience platforms as new competition. In some senses, learning management systems are trying to add more experience capabilities to make them more user-friendly. And at the same time, the learning experience platforms, now that they've got a foothold in, are also trying to grow and add the traditional learning management system functionality. So they're competing with each other in that way. Another thing that occurs to me as we're talking about those LXPs is part of the way that those LXPs got created is by off-the-shelf content vendors who have lots of courses that they'd like to sell to your organization. It's in their interest to have lots of people take it once they sold you the catalog, so it's not sitting around doing nothing. And so part of that LXP functionality came in as an easy way for people to find the content that they might take from off-the-shelf platforms. It's interesting to see to what extent you can make use of that recommendation functionality with the LXP platforms with your own custom content, as well as just that off-the-shelf content that might get bundled into some of the LXPs.
It sounds like LXPs, learning experience platforms, are like the new hot thing. But learning management systems still have their uses. I imagine it's a matter of the growing content library and good organization skills.
I think it's about that question of how do I, as a learner, find what it is that I want to take next to grow in my career? And the LXP is one of the new competitors in that area. But you might also look at learning portals as a solution to that problem, an easy way to navigate and find what it is that you want to take. If we talk about what a learning portal is, it really should be a user-friendly interface that organizes all the learning content that's important to me. A learning portal might be targeted for within the organization. How do I start from the top and find all of my content, whether it's located in the learning management system or the LXP or on SharePoint or wherever it might be. But a learning portal might have a smaller scope than that too. For instance, if I'm in a leadership role or a sales role, maybe a portal is organized just so that I can find all the content that's related to me, and I'll get my compliance training from the LMS because it's assigned to me, and I don't necessarily care about finding all that other content that's not relevant to me. So in some way, the learning portal will organize content to make it easy for me to find, going through its interface to find it, whereas the LXP a little different, trying to look at what I've been doing in the past and surface recommendations for me.
I'm wondering, how do I pick something? Like, how do you do the selection and all this? Like, if I wanted to pick a learning management system or a learning experience platform or even a learning portal, how do I actually go through a selection process to pick something?
At the high level, the selection process is fairly similar regardless of which of these systems you're looking for. You need to start out with defining your requirements very clearly, and you want to do that with a cross-functional team. So you want to make sure that all the right players are in the room defining what is the functionality that we need from this system. And that will include not only the functional requirements, what does this system do, but also you would need to have your IT involved to make sure that it's going to be compatible with your computers and your servers and your security requirements and so on. And you want to decide as a group of those stakeholders, these are the things that we think that our system might need. So depending on the size of your group, you might just get together and meet to discuss about what requirements you need. But if you have a larger group, I recommend to send out a survey so that you can then have people rate whether they think that requirement is something needed by the organization. And the benefit of that is that then you can narrow down from the hundreds of requirements that might be present in these systems, all the ones that you already agree you need, you don't need to talk about further, and all the ones you already agree you don't need to talk about further, so you can conserve meeting time to just talk about the places where it's not clear whether those functions are needed or not. Then you're going to want to see some demos of the systems, and then I highly recommend a request for proposal process that makes everything apples to apples for comparison across vendors. So we do have a white paper that we put together that talks about how to select these systems, and we'll include it in the resources for this podcast.
The whole point of like all these systems besides delivering training is there's tracking involved. Like, how do you know that someone took training, and how do I remember what training I took? I know from developing e-learning and other kinds of learning that integrating into these systems can be very important, and standards are something you always got to watch. What do you see happening with tracking that?
So what's happening in this space is that traditional tracking systems use the SCORM and AICC tracking, which would be able to check whether you took it and to be able to check what kind of scores could you get on a post-test to show that you had learned some knowledge based on taking that training. With newer models of training like augmented and virtual reality and serious games that allow a lot more ability to practice than just asking some multiple choice questions or drag and drop type questions, there's more that we want to log than just what kind of score did you get at the end of it, right? And so that's where the XAPI Learning Record Store comes into play. The difference with the Learning Record Store versus the Learning Management System is pretty much anything that you take in a Learning Management System, you've got to start from the Learning Management System and launch a new browser window to take it and get tracked back into the Learning Management System. But with the Learning Record Store, you don't have to find it in a course catalog, and you don't have to launch it from the system. You can put on the VR headset and start taking the course and then track back to the Learning Record Store. And you can track things beyond just what kind of score did you get. You can track what you're actually doing in the experience.
That sounds like an evolution of the SCORM standard. I know in SCORM you can track like what questions people took and what they answered, how they did, and how many attempts they made. It sounds like you can do even more with the XAPI.
Yes, and in fact, the XAPI standard is an evolution developed in the same fashion as the AICC SCORM standards and is the next evolution of the SCORM standards, or the eventual probably replacement, although SCORM still has its purpose for what it's used for. So I don't think that it will go away. They'll continue to both be used, but for their own purposes.
It sounds like you have to get a lot more information before you can implement XAPI. I know usually with like SCORM, the questions are we using 1.2 or 2004, and which completion tracking are we using is generally the minimal information you need. But I think from what I've read and seen and used about XAPI, you need a lot more information to really get it implemented.
So it depends upon what you're trying to do with it. So if you're trying to log your own things, you need to give a lot of thought about how you're going to format the statements that track those so that you'll be able to report in a consistent way later. On the other hand, if you are using it with traditional authoring tools, they're beginning to have already built in the capability to track. So there's also CMI5, which uses XAPI to track, but is intended to simplify using it by making it easy to track the things that you would track in a traditional e-learning course already. For instance, if you use Storyline and you use its built-in XAPI tracking, a lot of the complexity is gone. But on the other hand, if you're creating a virtual reality thing and you're sending from Unity for custom logging, yes, the complexity you were talking about is there, and you've got a lot to figure out.
You mentioned reports. And one of the things I've always thought about with the reports is the old garbage in, garbage out acronym from computers way back when. If you don't have good information coming in, you really can't get good reports out. But how do reports work into all this?
So interestingly, in the LMS selection projects and across these types of selections, one of the questions that people are always looking for is, I want to be able to create any kind of report I want. Does the system allow me to customize and create my own reports later? Or do I have to wait for somebody else with more programming experience to create those reports for me? And dashboards, right? I want to have a nice graphical view that shows me how my team is doing and want to be able to see that easily without having to scan through the reports. So the ability to create nice-looking reports out of any tracking system is always something that organizations are looking for.
It seems like there's a number of like LMSs and other systems out there that are like free or open source, and the reporting that's included with those often seems to be kind of limited because they don't spend as much time on the reporting end as they do on the general storing and tracking end. But then when you get into the more expensive paid-for systems, they include more reporting. At least it seems like.
I think there are variances in how good the reports are out of different systems, but I think that it is a common concern that it's hard to predict in advance what all your customers might want. And until you actually have the requirements for what needs to go on the report, it's hard to say whether it would be able to do it from any system. I think that also leads to the idea of, if my system doesn't provide the reports I need, can I then export it out to another system like Tableau or Microsoft Power BI and use one of those systems that's all about generating analytics and reports to make my own report? But that comes in at a cost of needing to integrate with those systems or export and import into those systems. So to the extent that you can find a system that meets your reporting needs, great if you can do that without having to try to export to another place to then report from there.
I think sometimes you need to look at the whole picture. I believe if we just look at like, what do we need right now, but we don't think about what kind of reporting are we going to need or what kind of data do we need to be able to get out of here so we can actually have the management of all the training and the employees and everything that we need. If we don't think about that in the beginning, then later on you're like, now we need to think about this, but does the system support it? I don't know. And then you're tacking on solutions afterwards, and that can be a lot harder than if you had thought about the whole picture in the beginning. But I think that's part of that, like that LMS selection process you were talking about.
Yeah, and in your learning strategy, the evaluation strategy, what it is you need to measure to know whether you're making a difference will drive what kind of reports you'll need, which will drive what kind of system you should have to make sure you have those reports. Elevating to the strategic level and thinking about what it is you need to accomplish before picking how you're going to do it, what you're saying is common sense, yes.
I mean, unfortunately, it is common sense, but sometimes we get so focused on the right now that we don't think about the future.
Well, and it's difficult, right? Because there's all the time mergers and acquisitions going on, and someone else is coming into a job that someone else held before, and they selected the system, and now you've got to live with it. By no means is it going to be easy to have all of this stuff operating properly in your organization all the time. It's going to be a challenge.
I think we just got to do the best we can and try to predict as much as we can and eventually not be paralyzed by indecision and pick something and move forward. So we've talked about a lot of things, Matt, but you mentioned the learning strategy. How do you see technology fitting in with a learning strategy?
Clearly, technology is going to be important to your learning strategy, whether you're thinking about your learning strategy as a whole or specifically your e-learning strategy. Obviously, the technology is important when you're taking e-learning because you're thinking about the devices that you're using, as well as what are the authoring tools used to create that and how do you track it. But even if it weren't for e-learning, even if you're tracking instructor-led or virtual instructor-led, it still comes down to the technology of these tracking systems and how do you know if they're going to fit in with your organizational standards, and how do you know if you're going to get the value out of them. And I don't think you'll be able to do that without considering the technology components.
So we've had a lot of good discussion today. We talked about a lot of the different systems, the learning management systems, the learning experience platforms, the XAPI standard, learning portals, and you helped us by talking about the selection process and all about the tracking and how it can impact reporting. If you want to learn more about learning management and tracking systems, we posted some resources at the bottom of this episode's page. Also, if you have any learning technology topics you'd like us to talk about, Matt and I are on Twitter. You can also send us an email at marketing@innovativelg.com.
Thank you for listening. Tune in next time when we're going to be going through some advanced storyline tips and tricks.